Have you ever had something similar to what you're seeing on screen right here, where you're queued up and you have a healer and 3 DPS in your group, and you're just sitting there waiting for a tank, but no tank applies? Where are the tanks? Why were we able to fill our DPS slots in a matter of seconds, but it's been taking minutes for a healer or a tank to be able to sign up for something as simple as a weekly key? Why is it like this? For many people, this is the reality of the situation, is that finding a tank for their group actually can take a lot of time. So this is a phenomenon called bottlenecking. And what happens is basically whenever there are too much or too little of one specific group of people, in this instance tanks, to be able to match the number of DPS or healers that are available in the ecosystem, that creates a situation where it takes a lot longer for groups to just be formed in general. If you think about this in like League of Legends terms, think about the ability to be able to play support, how if you click queue up whenever you're playing support, you immediately get into a game, whereas if you're playing something like a mid laner, it takes you probably 5 to 10 minutes before you even get into a game, even at relatively low MMRs. Bottlenecking is a pretty serious thing in role-based games because players have a tendency to kind of stick to the roles that they find more enjoyable or more entertaining for one reason or another, and they tend to stay away from different roles, again, for particular reasons. I think it's kind of interesting to kind of take a look at this Cyber tweet that you see on screen right here. And he said, an interesting part of my 0 to hero is how empty LFG seems to be at these lower key levels. Besides a +7 floodgate, it's been barren. I think a Mythic plus solo queue system could help. And I think that for a lot of people, this, especially for DPS players, this would actually end up making sense. But if you end up taking a look at what his group actually is, LFG isn't barren. He has 3 DPS in his group, right? So he had the ability to be able to fill DPS just like that, right? Just at the snap of his fingers, he had 3 DPS in his group immediately, and now they're just sitting there waiting for that bottleneck to kind of loosen up, and a healer or a tank, or healer and a tank, I guess in this instance, are going to be looking to apply to his group. So at a glance, I think for a lot of people, a solo queue system could benefit them, right? Particularly these DPS who aren't necessarily playing the most meta thing, or are appropriately qualified, and we're going to talk about overqualification in Mythic Plus in just a little bit, but are appropriately qualified for the keys, and they would rather have the system be first come, first serve, as opposed to what LFG currently is, where you're taking the best available candidate with some level of skepticism, right? For some people, it would probably decrease the average amount of time waiting, but I think for the system as a whole, it would probably end up increasing it. I've talked about, solo queue before in Mythic Plus. If you want, go watch a past video. I talked about it with Growl on the bench a couple weeks back. So if you want that kind of thing, go watch it. Without getting into it too much, it would probably end up increasing the queue times just on the system as a whole, which wouldn't end up positively affecting anything. And so why I'm making this video today is to kind of talk about that bottlenecking phenomenon between tanks and healers and how it's actually making the game worse and impacting players in a pretty negative light. So what I will say is I think it's mostly a social issue, right? For a lot of players, whenever they start to begin the game, they are presented with a choice. Are they going to play tank, healer, or DPS? And they kind of have to pick a class at that point too. And for most people, the class that the character that they picked back in 2007 is largely still the same character that they might be playing today. And it's probably still the same role. Now, the reason that they didn't pick tank or healer is pretty obvious, right? Whenever you're presented with what does this role do? Oh, okay, I gather up mobs, I tank big hits, I'm more the supporty style where I'm able to help the group, but I'm not going to get a lot of the glory. Okay, makes sense as to why people wouldn't pick tank. And healer, kind of a similar situation. You're a supporty, I raise health bars, I heal my allies up type of situation, where it's, again, more of a supporty playstyle, where a lot of people, whenever they hear DPS, oh, you get to do big damage, you're the carry of the group. That to them is what being in it, that's what's cool about an MMO just in general, is being that carry in your group. But right now we have a severe lack of tank players, and Overwatch, kind of interestingly enough, had a discussion as to whether or not 5v5 versus 6v6 playership was going to end up being better. And I ended up reading through this director's take talking about average competitive role time queues whenever they were looking at 5v5 versus 6v6. And if you take a look on the screen here, whenever they were doing 6v6, which required 2 tanks in the group, the average queue time for most DPS players was 7.6 minutes. So tanks, they were getting into groups relatively quickly with an average wait time of 1.8 minutes because they needed 2 tanks for the role. But there weren't enough tanks in the ecosystem to be able to satiate how many DPS players there realistically were. So whenever Overwatch 2 came out and they went into 5v5, this then decreased the wait time for DPS queues and cut it almost in half, a little bit over half, actually, in terms of how long they're waiting. And if we take this and kind of apply this level of skepticism to Mythic Plus, it works in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, there would be more groups formed if there were more tanks and additionally more healers, but tank, I think, is by far the biggest bottleneck right now. And so realistically, if there are more tanks, then there's going to end up being more groups formed. Now, another consequence of the bottleneck as well, especially with how LFG just as a system really realistically ends up working, is whenever you have an appropriately qualified tank and an appropriately qualified healer, they have basically the pick of the litter for DPS to be able to select in their group. And so what this ends up meaning is that they're going to end up taking overqualified people. And whenever I say overqualified, I'm talking about they're playing meta specializations, they're higher IO than is required for that group, and it just kind of ends up boxing out appropriately qualified candidates, whether or not they're playing something that's deemed less meta, whether or not they're 20, 30, 40 points below somebody else. That can potentially be factors into why these other people aren't getting into groups. Which, of course, this makes sense whenever you look at it in the context of you're presented with players on a list, and all you see about them is their item level and their IO, and you don't really see too much about them, right? You only see their item level, their IO, and what class they end up playing. Of course, you're going to take the person who is overqualified for your group whenever you have an abundance of applicants. And that's why the bottleneck is actually so dangerous. If you go and take a look at the Spec popularity Mythic Plus for War Within Season 2, this is a chart that can be taken from Rare. I'm looking at it on Wowhead. But whenever you're looking at weekly level keys where class balance realistically doesn't matter in the slightest, you're seeing pretty reasonable representation among all the specializations. This tends to track pretty closely with how many of the specializations are being played on a much larger player base scale and the amount of classes or whatever that are at max level. And so this ends up tracking pretty closely. And then at the point at which keys no longer becomes like super easy, so we're going to take 12s in this instance, you see a very drastic shift start to take effect where players start to consolidate down into more meta specializations. And that's because whenever the content is no longer trivial, you're not taking the first applicant in your group. You are starting to look at the groups with a little bit more skepticism and taking these overqualified applicants. And then that gives the tank and the healer, who again are appropriately qualified for the key, or maybe even potentially underqualified for the key. This creates a situation where you're going to have DPS players being somewhere probably around like 50 to 100 points higher than their tank and their healer counterparts. Because the tank and the healer, they might be appropriately qualified for that key. Say they've done all 11s, now they're looking to try to prog 12s. The DPS, as a result, are expected to have half of their 12s already done before they could be even considered to get into that group, or maybe even potentially already have all their 12s done, and for some reason there's some whale in the group who's just there for the vibes, and he ended up taking a slot from a different DPS who would have appropriately been qualified for those kind of groups. And that's why the bottleneck is so dangerous, is because then, of course, what are players going to do? They're going to re-roll into meta specializations, particularly DPS. And DPS are pushed now more than ever to make sure that they are on FOTM specializations. And I kind of talked about this in videos in the past about why I'm playing Flavor of the Month specializations is important. World of Warcraft is a fantastic game, and I have so much fun playing the game. But the hardest part about playing the game is actually getting into the group for a lot of people. I think that, in general, you should probably be listing your key. That's going to be an easy, fast track to guarantee that you're always in the group. But for a lot of people, they don't want to play that like that, right? They would rather just like click a list on LFG and then get accepted into the group. And there's only so many specs in the game that can realistically be meta. I think that this season's a great example of a spec that has pretty reasonable spec diversity. But even still, if you take a look at the spec diversity within the top 2,000 Mythic Plus keys, which ends up going on to shape the meta, like it or not, you're still seeing some very heavy trends, players trending towards Arcane Mage, Balance Root, and Unholy Decay. And then, of course, players are going to then start complaining about how OP those specializations are because they feel like the fact that those specs are OP is the reason that they're no longer getting into groups. And Growl had a great rant about this on the bench a couple weeks ago where he was talking about in terms of Disc Priest, where players weren't even mad that Disc Priest was OP. Players were mad that they felt like they weren't getting into groups because they felt like Disc Priest was OP. And for a lot of people, the perception is reality, where it's less about, is your specialization capable of doing this key? It's more about like, is this going to make the dungeon easier in any meaningful capacity? Do I think it's going to make the dungeon easier in any meaningful capacity? And I don't have any information on these players. So of course I'm going to take somebody who's either higher IO, higher item level, or in a lot of instances on a more desirable specialization and what I deem to be a more desirable specialization. And so here's the thing that needs to change. I think just straight across the board in the game, we need more tanks. And honestly, we need a little bit more healers as well to be able to balance out the amount of DPS. I've been asked the question before, what would happen if they added a 4th DPS slot to Mythic Plus? I do think it'd help even out the ecosystem. I don't think Blizzard would ever really go for that. dungeons have always been 5-man content. I also think that adding a 6th player into groups makes it a little bit harder to continue to create groups. And I think that's something that's nice about Mythic Plus is it's not that hard to actually get 5 players together to be able to continue to progress a dungeon. What I think that does need to change, though, is I think that we need more tanks and we need more healers. As to how to do that, I'm not actually sure. I don't know if there's a great way of doing it. People talk about adding call to arms for tank roll and LFG and stuff like that. I think that that would be, not bad, but I don't think it meaningfully moves the needle. I think it's something that's a little bit more social than anything else. And players talk about making tanks OP, and maybe people would be more willing to play tank. And I think that that's maybe the best idea. Just I would be looking at making the tank role so undeniably OP that more people, more than ever before, are willing to kind of dip their toes in and consider tanking in a way that they haven't in the past. In these seasons, that tanking is very difficult, like we saw in War Within Season 1, or in seasons that, tanking isn't super rewarding, or they have to deal with stupid stuff like threat. Of course, players aren't realistically going to want to have to deal with those social pressures because there's already other social pressures that are involved with tanking. You're already expected to know the route. You're already expected to kind of be that leader of the group. And honestly, like 70 to 80% of the group responsibility as to whether or not the keystone is successful or not kind of lies on the tank. And a lot of people don't want that social pressure. So I think if you actually decrease the skill ceiling on their survivability a little bit, I think that this season is actually a pretty decent example of the skill ceiling being relatively fair for tank survivability. And then you also increased the amount of fun that players are having while they're tanking. And, this is subjective, but very few tanks love a lot of very intricate tank busters and having to battle with their DPS for threat. It's just not really a thing. And allowing them to do a little bit more damage to where they feel like they're more meaningfully contributing to the key, I think those are all ways to start to push players in the right direction where we're going to be able to potentially even get more tanks into the future. And the same thing kind of goes for healers, right? Healers kind of this weird support role where it's like a jack of all trades in Mythic Plus. I think that if you could just make healers like pretty strong and have healing be more meaningful in a way that feels rewarding, because I think that the issue right now is that healing really struggles to feel rewarding. And if you watch any Thune videos, he talks about it at length about the issues with healing just in general and why it doesn't feel as satisfying as he would prefer for it to be. I think that healers can be pretty OP and still have more agency in dungeons. Right now, we're kind of in a situation where Blizzard kind of reverts back to these one-shot situations all the time. And I think that that's not something that healers are always going to really be a fan of because they don't really feel like they have much to contribute. Healing also has this weird imbalance at lower level keys versus higher level keys, where at lower level keys, things don't one-shot you, but then the healer's expected to heal basically every piece of previously avoidable damage that would one-shot you to higher key, but it doesn't one-shot you because you're in a 10, and then they're expected to heal you, and if they don't heal you, then they type one heal in chat because they're stupid and they don't really know what's going on, and so then that kind of situation will arise occasionally. But I think that looking at these roles that are bottlenecking the formation of groups is integral to the success of Mythic Plus long-term, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below. Also, real quick before I go, I've been streaming every single day on Twitch, so if you're looking for that kind of content, or you're looking for more videos like this, come check out my stream where we kind of talk about a bunch of random stuff every single day. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.